welcome to another episode of Theology Thursdays. Today we're going to continue with the question we began last time, that central theological question of who Jesus is. In the last episode, we looked at the importance of the Old Testament in understanding the New Testament and therefore understanding who Jesus is. And our goal in this short series of lectures on this question of who Jesus is to answer the question Jesus gave in the Gospels, a question that he addresses to each of us. Who do you say that I am? Today I want to turn to the New Testament, especially the Gospels, and look at who Jesus is in the Gospels. Now, it's impossible to do that in a lot of depth in the time we have, but I just want to introduce the idea of who Jesus is in the Gospels and explore particularly how the Gospels, each of the Gospels, look at Jesus in a different way. But before I do that, I want to just say something about a central conundrum or difficulty for Jesus himself that we see in the Gospels in how he reveals who he is. And what I mean by that is that, remember, Jesus is born out of the Old Testament. He is a Jew. He is in Israel. And the central teaching of the Hebrew Bible, the central teaching of the Israelites, as revealed by God to Moses, is that there is one God. Not two gods, not three gods, one God. And as Christians, we believe that Jesus is truly divine, God. In fact, Jesus reveals a triune God, one God in three persons. So he can't spring from the womb of the Virgin Mary and say, "Hi everyone, I'm God," because he would have been killed a lot quicker than he was. And ultimately, the reason why he is crucified is that he claimed to be God. And again, we see in the Gospels this central difficulty for Jesus because he had to reveal this in a less explicit way than perhaps we may expect. It's little by little. And in those 3 years of public ministry, he could reveal a lot while not explicitly saying straight off the bat, "Hey, everybody, here's the doctrine of the Trinity." So it's this basic conundrum. It's also the conundrum of the revealing that he is the Messiah, the one that Israel is waiting for, the Son of David, the Messiah being the anointed one, the Christos. And we see this throughout the Gospels because whenever anyone says, "Hey, you're the Messiah," Jesus basically says, "Shh, don't tell anyone," because they're not ready. And similarly with the revelation about him being the Son of God, him being truly God himself from all eternity, is revealed little by little more implicitly. So that's by way of just, really important for us to understand that when we read the Gospels themselves. We have 4 Gospels, we know that, and each of the Gospels is presenting Jesus in a slightly different way, but we usually link 3 Gospels in particular together, and we term these the Synoptic Gospels because they basically give a synopsis of Jesus' life and we can sort of link them together. They basically follow a similar structure in terms of a life of Jesus. Now, the Gospels are not history books per se. They contain history. They contain events that happened in reality, and they point to historical facts. Historical figures are really important, particularly in Luke's Gospel. He's at pains to point out, exactly what's happening in the secular world to give the context of Jesus' life. But they are not history books per se. They are good news, and they present themselves as Gospels, good news. They are giving an account of the revelation of Christ himself. They are recordings of what Jesus said and did, but with an aim to save, with an aim to bring the good news of salvation. So they're not simply, a biography of a great person. There's aspects of that, obviously, but they are good news. So these first three Gospels, if you like, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are similar, but they also have their differences. So Matthew is, seen as really the Gospel that most incorporates the Old Testament with the New. It's the most Jewish, if you like, of the New Testament, the Gospels of the New Testament. And it presents Jesus particularly, with the Sermon on the Mount, which is particular to Matthew's Gospel, with the Beatitudes and the great Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is really the new Moses, a type, as we looked at in the previous presentation. A type of Jesus is Moses in the Old Testament. And so Jesus is the new Moses in Matthew's Gospel. In Luke's Gospel, Luke is a physician. Didn't know Jesus, personally, disciple of Paul. Tradition has it that, the Virgin Mary spoke to Luke as well. And so we have this account of Jesus that is more of an account that is directed towards the Gentiles, to the non-Jews. But having said that, it certainly incorporates the Old Testament. As I said last time, we can't understand Jesus without the Old Testament. So there's Luke, and then there's Mark, who's the shortest gospel. Mark, tradition again has it that this is an account of Jesus really through the eyes of Peter. He was perhaps Peter's secretary in Rome. By secretary there, I mean someone who worked with Peter, was a disciple of Peter in Rome, and it's perhaps Peter's account of the life of Christ. So they're the three synoptic. And then we have John's Gospel. Now John is the gospel of the beloved disciple, the one who leant on the breast of Jesus at the Last Supper, who, as St. Thomas Aquinas says in his commentary on John's Gospel, he says that Isaiah in the Old Testament and John in the New Testament, the Gospel of John, are the books of Scripture that go to such great heights, that go above everything else in Scripture. Why? Because they were true friends of God. And John himself, as I said at the Last Supper, heard the beating heart of Jesus in this last banquet of Jesus with his friends. And so John's Gospel is very different than the other Gospels, and that's why it's not one of the synoptic Gospels. It lays on its own in some respects in that sense. John, in traditional artwork, or the traditional symbol for John, is the eagle, because it soars. His Gospel just soars above. It's really seeing Jesus through all of eternity. Remember, John's Gospel starts with the great prologue. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, and this Word became flesh. And that's the Gospel reading of the Christmas Day Mass, seeing Jesus from all eternity then becoming one of us. So John's Gospel is less concerned with the sort of day-to-day life account of Jesus. There is certain day-to-day life events of Jesus there, but the events or the 7 signs or miracles of Jesus in John's Gospel are, very long in terms of their description, and a lot more dialogue, a lot more words of Jesus in John's Gospel. For the purpose of today, though, I just thought it might concentrate a little bit on Mark's Gospel, because within Mark's Gospel we have a lovely account of 4 miracles of Jesus in a row. And I think they go to the heart, really, of how the Gospels, when we see them with new eyes, because a lot of the accounts of Jesus' life we've perhaps heard since we're little, or even if we're coming to them for the first time, they're overladen with cultural, for want of a better word, baggage, that we often see, okay, I'm reading the Gospels, these are nice stories, they're nice. If I read these, it's a bit sort of like a nice sort of fairy tale. But when we actually read them with fresh eyes, what strikes us is how strange they are. The Gospels are, extraordinary in terms of what they are trying to explain, really. And you get a sense too of these first Christians. They they were encountering something that was beyond anything they could imagine, beyond anything that you could simply write down in an account. So I think in Mark's Gospel is really good for this, because Mark is to the point. It's the shortest Gospel, and so in some ways, when I talk about what's a good Gospel to read if you're just coming to the New Testament for the first time, Mark's Gospel's a great one to do. But also Mark gives little flourishes in his Gospel that make them sometimes a bit more readable. So I'm just going to talk about these four miracles just briefly in Mark's Gospel, and just to give you the references. So it's from the end of the 4th chapter of Mark's Gospel, so from verse 35 right through to the end of chapter 5, we have these four miracles. So the first one is where Jesus is asleep on the boat, and he's with his disciples, and they're going over on the Sea of Galilee. So they're moving away from Israel over to the other side, to the Gentile side, away from Israel, and they're on the boat. And this is the account of the storm on the boat, and Jesus is asleep on the boat. So just even thinking about that. So if here's the Son of God, God himself asleep. It's the only time in the Gospels where we see Jesus asleep. So he's asleep on the boat, and there's a big storm. And the disciples, we know, are very, very fearful, and they wake Jesus up, saying, aren't you scared? And Jesus is a little bit dismissive of them, and then he's also dismissive of the storm. He just simply says, be calm. And the storm is calmed. They get to the other side. And here is this extraordinary account of Jesus and the Gerasene. They're in the Gerasene, the land of the Gerasene. The Gerasene demoniac. And this is really straight out of a horror novel. When you read the description of this Gerasene demoniac, a Stephen King novella perhaps, where the Gerasene demoniac is described as living amongst the tombs. So just picture that. He's in basically a cemetery. He has these chains around him because they've tried to chain him up because he self-harms. It talks about him beating himself. He self-harms, and he screams these guttural screams. And obviously all the people of this place are petrified of this crazy supernatural figure here that they encounter. So this man is possessed by many, many demons. And so Jesus heals him by casting these demons out. And he doesn't just cast them out, but he casts them out into a swineherd, into the pigs. And the pigs are then possessed, and then they jump off the cliff and are drowned. So just picture all that, imagine all that in your head. It's an extraordinary scene. And here Jesus, on perhaps a symbolic level, is purifying this land, because there is a swineherd. It's not Israel, so they can eat the pork. And he's purifying this land. He's purifying it and sending the swineherd into the sea. And this former demoniac, is healed, and he's at peace, and he says to Jesus, I want to follow you. And Jesus says, well, you can't. You're not Israelite. You can't follow me. Nevertheless, this man still goes off to the Decapolis, the 10 cities, the 10 Gentile cities, to preach about Jesus. He's the first evangelist. The first Gentile evangelist here was the Gerasene demoniac. And so then they go back. They get on the boat, and they're going back. They get back to the other side. And Jesus is met by Jairus, whose daughter is dying. And Jairus says, you've got to come quickly. She's dying. So Jesus says, okay, I come. So he's here, calmed the storm. He's healed the Gerasene demoniacs. This is all in one sort of sweep in Mark's Gospel. He gets to the other side, and Jairus invites him to come and heal. And as they're going, there's a big crowd following Jesus. Big crowd. And there's a woman with the hemorrhaging, who's been hemorrhaging for many, many years. And she says to herself, if I can only touch this man, I will be healed. And so she reaches out, touches him, and is healed. And this is the account where Jesus is, in a sense, performs this miracle. Performs not a great word when you're talking about miracles, but this miracle is done to this woman, and without any, in a sense, consent even from Jesus. And she is healed, and he says to her, your faith has made you well. And then he keeps going to Jairus' house, and by this stage, she's died. Jairus' daughter has died. And Jesus, someone says, "Oh, you're too late. Thanks for coming. You're too late. She's dead." And Jesus says, "No, she's not dead. She's asleep." And they all laugh at Jesus. They laugh at him, mock him in a sense. Who is this guy? And then he takes the three closest disciples with him, Peter, James, and John, into the house, clears the house out, goes into the room where the daughter is, with Jairus and the mother, and just says to her, "Little girl, get up." And she sits up. So she's raised from the dead. And interestingly, in Mark's Gospel, this is why I really like Mark's Gospel, but he just basically says, he says then, give her a sandwich, give her something to eat. She's obviously hungry after having been dead. And so here we have these 4 miracles in a row. So from Mark 4:35 right through the end of chapter 5, beautifully described in sort of stark prose, and Jesus here is Lord of nature. He heals the storm, calms the storm. He's Lord of the spiritual world, so he casts out demons. He's Lord of the physical humanity in the sense of healing the woman with the hemorrhage, and he's also Lord of death itself. He's stronger than death. And this encapsulates, I think, this very short section in Mark encapsulates really the strangeness of the Gospels themselves, of the revelation of who Jesus is. And so it's really important for us to incorporate the Gospels in a new way to help us really answer this question of Jesus that he puts to us. Who do you say that I am? So if you've got any feedback or comments on today's or another episode, please put them in the comment section below. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and push that notification bell so you're notified when there's a new video. If you want to find out more about Campion College, I really encourage you to visit our website, and I really look forward to seeing you next time for another episode of Theology Thursdays. Please visit our website, and see you next time. And
Okay, let's try that again.
yes, I'll do the whole thing again. Yeah, little pause,
Pause.
and then go into it.